Today, we have a group of faculty here to speak for you. We have asked them to come and talk a little bit about some ideas. I want to thank them because we pulled this relatively quickly, meaning that we just actually asked them and said, hey, would you like to come and speak for a short amount of time, maybe a few minutes, and speak to people about some ideas about taking this notion of fascism seriously. Like, what is it? Is is it something that we need to fear? Is it not? What's the history of it? How does it function? All those kinds of things. So we've asked these scholars to come and speak scholarly about this particular topic, meaning that it has a long history that you can draw from and speak about, and they are individuals that have a history of looking into these kinds of topics. So this is, maybe if not their expertise, this is something that in some cases they put some thought into, and in other cases perhaps dedicated entire dissertations and books on issues that are related to this particular topic. Want to say anything?
Yeah, it's also important, I think, that we're at a moment where we're trying to understand what's going on right now in the world, and things are changing in really drastic and quick times. And so I think a lot of this is going to be kind of thoughts and beginning of a conversation on these topics. And so we hope to also have a large amount of time for conversation and question and answer, and for kind of a back and forth dialogue amongst us as well as everyone here, so we can start working through and thinking through these ideas and how they connect and relate to contemporary politics in the US and globally as well.
So with that, I'm going to turn to some of these faculty. They're going to have each exactly 10 minutes to speak on this. So we'll have 6 different individuals speak to you, and then we will open it up for questions and discussion. And I think, again, I just want to re-hit on the topic that Sean mentioned, and that is that this is very fluid. We have asked them to come and speak about this, like I said, in 10 minutes, but they a week ago for 10 minutes. And as scholars, I was already told earlier, we said, can you just come speak just for a little bit, just tell us what you think? And of course they said yes, and then one already said, well, when we say that, then what happens is you end up spending 3 days to talk to people for 10 minutes. So knowing these scholars, they put a lot of thought to try to figure out how to condense an enormous amount of information for you in a short period of time. So with that, I'll introduce some of the individuals. Dr. Kim Curtis will be speaking first. Then we'll have Dr. Sean Parson. Then we'll have Dr. Ray Michalowski speaking. Then Dr. Ari, I forgot your last name.
I just want to Dr. Ari.
Dr. Ari? Yeah, perfect. So Dr. Ari will be third. Fourth will be Dr. Sean Parson. Fifth will be Dr. Lori Polani. I hope I said that correctly. And I will be closing the evening, and then we'll be talking and discussing. So with that, I give you Dr. Kim Curtis.
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you so much for organizing this too. It's been upsetting as well with this topic. My topic tonight and why I'm going first is I'm talking with you about mid-20th century totalitarianism. And I'm going to talk about that, sketching key elements of it, drawing largely from the work of Hannah Arendt, The Origins of Totalitarianism, published in 1951. Then talk about ways I think it should haunt us today, with a couple of thoughts in closing on political action. I want to begin by saying that the U.S. is not a totalitarian state. It has, from its beginning, and with increasing intensity, exhibited totalizing tendencies and capacities, such as obsession with control, expansion, superiority, supremacy, and a revolutionary commitment to constant change. And these have undermined and made a mockery of democratic institutions, and they have deeply diminished democratic culture, which is about tending the spaces and the practices and the capabilities of the people so they can care for, co-create, and be responsible for a commonly shared world of plural others. So the people's ability to do this is under terrible assault from these totalizing tendencies, and our constitutional order is fragile. But the U.S. is not today a totalitarian state, in my opinion, and from Marx. So focusing on German totalitarianism, that's my focus, because race was at the center of that project. Here are key elements, and I'm going to be very schematic. The Nazis, one, organized society not by classes but as masses. That is, large numbers of people who were not integrated into any organization based on interest. It was this group of politically apathetic, isolated, and left behind people who the Nazis recruited and then mobilized, and which all other parties had given up as too apathetic or too stupid for their attention. I'm going to come back to that. Two, they organized these folks into revolutionary mass movements rather than into parties that represented discrete and particular interests. Three, they monopolized state power, mobilizing these movements in order to take over the economy, and then all pillars of society: churches, universities, business organizations, media, cultural institutions, all were either neutralized or suppressed. Four, they shifted power from the army to the police. Five, they used propaganda or organized lying as a key instrument of power, particularly to those outside the Nazi inner circle. Six, they were relentlessly ideological, meaning they deployed a single idea to explain all history. The struggle, the scientific struggle between the races, where the weak and degenerate will be annihilated as the master race wins out. And this they deployed openly in the pursuit of world domination. Seven, terror was their form of rule. Arendt describes the impact of terror on people as holding them in a band of iron, complete isolates, squeezed tightly together. People could not move, they could not discuss, they could not combine. And movement and combining are the elemental conditions for the exercise of freedom. What was unprecedented? Arendt didn't think the genocide was unprecedented. It was horrifying that it wasn't unprecedented. What was unprecedented, and I'm going to pull out two major things, was one, the aim to remake reality itself, essential to which was extinguishing spaces of debate, encounter, speech, opinion, and interest formation, a world, in short, that gathers and separates us, a plural world of others. So that was central to the project of remaking reality, was extinguishing those spaces. The second thing that she argued, which was unprecedented, was that the aim of totalitarianism was to make the uniqueness of the human person superfluous. Whether in concentration camps, in the terror units, or in the highest levels of bureaucracy, both victims and executioners lived in a world in which who they were as distinctive beings had no place. The effect was, she thought, the unforgivable reduction of the human person to living corpses. So what should haunt us about all this? A lot. But today, first, the resonances with the Trump regime's cocktail of fear, racist scapegoating as an instrument of mobilization, delegitimizing the press, the judiciary. There's more coming, I'm sure. Those two are critically targets right now. Remaking reality through the emancipation from not only empirical facts and evidence-supported claims, but also without any concern for and an embarrassment about their unscrupulousness, the corruption, the lying, endorsement of torture, where profound economic suffering combined with deep social isolation is the condition we live in. The psychological consequences of this are that losers feel superfluous, expendable, a condition that produces, Arndt argued, not only anger, which it does, but, she said, a radical loss of self-interest. What she called a fatalistic selflessness. Very interesting to think about this. Where people are vulnerable in that kind of a condition, that psychological condition. People are vulnerable, prone to manipulation, and certain recklessness. So, in the recent election, many asked, how can the poor and the working class vote against their interests? Arndt's analysis suggests we look for the answer in these material and psychological conditions in dynamics and mission objects. A couple of thoughts on action. Don't underestimate what is going on today. Don't underestimate. Someone asked me to say this. Do not underestimate what is going on today and what it could become. And I'm going to give you an example of that underestimation pull from many, many different places. It was an article, an op-ed, or an article in the New York Times that Paul Krugman, the economist, wrote, I think, last week, maybe the week before. And he's writing about the Trump administration floating a 20% tariff on Mexican imports. And this is what he says, so this is a direct quote. He says, this loose talk epitomizes the pattern we are already seeing in this shambolic administration, a pattern of dysfunction, ignorance, incompetence, and betrayal of trust. When I look at what's happening today, I think this is a radical under-reading of what's going on. What's going on is a ruthless experimentation with the limits of possibility. What can we do? So don't underestimate either what is going on or what could develop. I think that's one of the main, I don't know if that's a thought on action. Yeah, it is. Underestimate. It's an action. Terrible. The second is organize the like-minded to protect, defend, and resist the targeting of vulnerable groups and fascist policies. Form worlds where people can see each other and identify common interests, develop a sense of shared fate and collective power. And I know many of you are doing that. The third, many of you probably aren't doing, which is reach beyond the like-minded and don't demonize or ridicule. Isolated, left-out people are dangerous. Draw them into conversation, hear stories, see if and where common cause can be made and organized. Our culture as our people is deformed by a dog-eat-dog sense of the world, and many are deeply atomized and feel expendable. It's a breeding ground. Disrupt it. Thank you.
Well, first of all, I wanted to thank, I'm Ray Markowski, organizer for this. I want to thank you all for coming. This is a remarkable turnout. None of us had a chance to really share what we were going to do, so you're going to hear a little bit of overlap here. I'm going to also go back in history a little bit, but primarily with the aim of, again, throwing that history against the future for a particular reason. I'm going to pretty much stick to a prepared text here, because those of you who know me, that if I start to extemporize, I will never stay within the 10-minute limit that I'm going to give. Okay. So, I have not. Now, I'm starting my timer right now, so I can keep checking. Okay. Like beauty, truth, and evil, the word fascism is both powerful and imprecise. It is powerful because it conjures up a something so fundamentally wrong that its very mention is horrifying. It is imprecise because it's been applied to so many different political practices that it has lost almost any coherent meaning. Broadly speaking, the word fascism has been used in four different ways. First, as an analytic term used to reference the totalitarian states that emerged in Italy, Germany, and Japan after World War I and served as their organizing framework into and throughout World War II. Secondly, it has been used as a rather protein, open-ended word to condemn almost any form of political leadership that, in the eyes of those leveling the accusation, violates some of the principles of democracy. What do Lyndon Johnson, Richard Nixon, Ronald Reagan, George Bush, Barack Obama, and Donald Trump all have in common besides being presidents of the United States? Right. They were all called fascist by some people who objected to their policies. The third usage that I'm going to refer to is actually birthed from Gross's concept of friendly fascism, which is a bizarre term, but he used this in 1980 to argue that the United States was heading toward a future in which a secretly democratic America would eventually be governed by a despotic network consisting of a relatively invisible and small number of ultra-rich global corporate managers working in concert with a chief executive network and a military hierarchy. And finally, the term is being used currently to describe the political consequences of neoliberal globalization, using, not surprisingly, the term neo-fascism. Before I continue, I want to share a caution from a political scientist, Alan Wolf. He wrote this one critiquing Gross's notion of friendly fascism. Wolf wrote, fascism, at least the version practiced by Hitler and Mussolini, was a state of radical uniqueness in its terror and barbarity against the human spirit that the social scientist has an obligation never to use the term again unless it refers to the real thing. It is a profound insult to the victims of genocide to label as fascist, with or without any particular adjective, the trends emerging in American society, no matter how ugly those trends may be. Now, I'm not sure I agree entirely with Wolf's claim that social scientists should never use the word fascism, except when referring to classical fascism. However, I do think there is some need for analytic clarity when we do use the word, and we should avoid using it as a moral bludgeon against forms of despotism, even ugly forms, that do not rise to the level of fascism. Now, if I can make the technology work here. Okay, great. Okay, so I've got some copies of this. I only made 40, but if you all would kind of pass those out and share. So keeping Wolf's caution in mind, I want to address two questions. The first is, to what extent does the current U.S. presidential administration, headed by the rapist-in-chief Donald Trump, display characteristics associated with classical fascism? And second, to what extent can we say that Gross's prediction that the United States was on a path to being governed by a new form of totalitarianism correct? Now, classical fascism was characterized by a particular heinous and tripartite relationship between capitalist industry and finance, a totalitarian state, and a robust and aggressive military, to which were added a constellation of singular characteristics. And these are, up here as well. Read that or not, but I'll actually talk about that. These are characteristics. A charismatic dictator, one-party rule, which the fascist party displaces the historic state. Government by decree rather than legislation. Courts subservient to the party. Demonization of outgroups purported to pose existential threats to national life, culture, and identity. Establishment of the sovereign as sole source of truth, hypernationalism, and mobilization of mass support for irrational ideas. I would say we're far too early into the Trump presidency to have any real way of knowing if the Republic will survive his term in office, or be replaced by a classically fascist state, or some other form of totalitarianism. However, I suggest that we can assess inclinations of the executive to see how they just look against this. So that's what I have up here. Okay. We have a charismatic dictator. Well, we have a charismatic leader for sure, someone who is seen as charismatic by a significant portion of the polity. That leader has a will to dictatorship. I think that's fairly clear in his overweening kind of egomania. However, when we have a dictatorship, has that been achieved? Probably not now, and I would say probably never. One-party rule was the fascist state, the fascist party displaced the state. I would say not yet, and I'm also going to say at this point, I don't see any apparent will to create more of a single-party state than we already have. And that, I mean that in two terms. One, there is only one party in the United States, and that's the Capitalist Party. It has two wings, and as it turns out, one of those two wings may achieve the goal of a permanent Republican majority, unless there are changes in the electoral process and so on. So, I don't see any real change coming in. Government by decree rather than legislation? No, not yet. However, we clearly see a will to govern by decree as executive orders. Courts subservient to the party? Not yet. Although we clearly see efforts to delegitimize courts that disagree, as per the notion of the so-called judge remark, which was the first kind of out-of-the-box shot against the judge, being the first one to contradict Donald. Demonization of threatening outgroups? Absolutely. Characterization of Mexican immigrants, Muslims, and homegrown criminals as existential threats to the so-called American way of life were and remain essential to the executive ideological framework. Establishing the sovereign as the sole source of truth by silencing channels of criticism? Not yet, but we clearly see efforts to achieve that goal. The whole idea that news displeasing to the administration is, by definition, fake news, and it can be proven fake by alternative facts, I think are pretty clear. As Scott Nell Hughes told Diane Rehm, Mr. Trump's tweets amongst a large part of the population are true. When he says that millions of illegal people illegally voted, people believe they have the facts to back it up. So moving in that direction, but we're not there. There are a lot of alternative narratives that also come forth in the blogosphere and certainly in the press. Hyper-nationalism? Absolutely. That is the essence of the America First policy. And rendering irrational ideas plausible to a large portion of the power? Absolutely. Take your pick. The campaign was littered with crazy, crowd-inciting claims, such as global warming was a hoax cooked up by the Chinese to damage American business. The United States is in an utter state of collapse. American cities were nothing but sites of carnage. And you could go on and on with all of these claims, completely irrational in the sense that there is no evidence for them whatsoever, and nevertheless highly mobilizing. So, based on my little scan, and we can talk about that later, but what I see is there's a will toward all of those things that are characteristic of classic fascism. How close are we? In some cases, very close. Some places, pretty far away. What's the trend? Moving in that direction, moving away from that direction, and what's the chance of success will be achieved with those? Now, here, I want to kind of shift gears a little bit. My concern is that Trump's extremism our concern with Trump's extremism may miss something important and larger. And I certainly don't want to minimize the threats that we see and were, I think, so articulately presented just before me. But I want to suggest that, or one of the concerns I have, is that Trump's extremism is the shiny object that keeps our attention focused on this particular manifestation of right-wing tendencies in the United States, and keeps us from considering the underlying and antecedent ways that the U.S. polity has largely been convinced to surrender any chance for equality in return for some chance at liberty. And I want to repeat that. It is my argument that a large portion of the U.S. polity has already been convinced to surrender any chance at equality for some chance at liberty. Now here I'm building off of Gross's predictions of the U.S. trajectory in which he saw the country on a path toward a new form of political, economic, and ideological domination that, while avoiding the overt brutalities and naked totalitarianism of the fascist states of the mid-20th century, would nevertheless create a nation ruled by a small and invisible elite in ways as debilitating to genuine democracy as the formerly cruder fascist states of Europe. Now, the key characteristics that he saw as creating this, right, was first of all, you had this triumvirate of capitalism and finance, one, government and the military, together with these characteristics. And you can flip over, okay? So in 1980, he predicts the... So in 1980, he predicts the emergence of transnational capitalism. He says we have to stop thinking about capitalism as a national phenomenon, is transnational, and the organization and the management of capital is international. That transnational capitalism will be overseen by a relatively obscure network of ultra-rich and corporate overseers. The centralized power of the state will emerge in the form of a chief executive network rather than an individual despot. You think about the growth and what he used the term the imperial presidency to say that we had this growth in the power of that centralized network. And just as an aside today, we think of Donald Trump as overusing the executive order. But presidents before him each incrementally have expanded the power of the presidents to do that. This is not new. This may be a further and perhaps more dangerous step, but it is not new. A powerful military bureaucracy as one of the key elements of that chief executive network. And mass media dominated by hegemonic interpretations of the meaning of life, freedom, and government. And here, I want to refer to Dr. Polony's beautiful view of what human life could be versus the hegemonic model of life under capitalism. And for many years, I taught popular culture. And one of the things I would try to convince my students, you are the subject of propaganda. And they would say, that's not propaganda in the United States. I would say, of course. This is 1980. And in 1980, the average college student was taking in 2,500 advertising messages a day. So I said, you were subject to the propaganda that said buy. Okay? And lastly, a fear of internal terror as a justification for limiting rights and freedoms. These are all things that Gross predicted in 1980, and I think you can measure his predictions against the presence, that these would in fact create a kind of national climate that accepts a willingness to capitulate to both capitalist order and to the powerful central state because of, one, the fear of the terror, but secondly, we can't even imagine, the vast majority can't even imagine something other than a world where we just fight and struggle with each other for our share of the pie.
My throat just gets tired because I lecture all week. So, all right. Hello, everyone. I'm Dr. Ari. My pronouns are they, them, theirs. Thanks, Luis, for inviting me to be on this panel, and Sean. Thanks to both of you. Thanks for all of you being here tonight. I spent part of this morning reading online book lists with various versions of a title that went something like this: 10 books to read to help you survive Trump fascism. I want to disrupt the monolithic you, the monolithic we, the monolithic woman, the monolithic queer. Because the you who is trying to survive fascism differs greatly depending on whether or not you has access to a job that pays a true living wage, not just $12 an hour or $14 an hour, but a true living wage. What that you is dealing with in relation to mental health and mental illness and the triggers that assault us. How that you is impacted by colonialism, racism, xenophobia, and Islamophobia, whether that you is experiencing misogyny in a culture we live in that hates women and those presumed to be women, and how that shows itself as racialized misogyny and transmisogyny, as well as the hatred of the feminine, especially if that person is not female assigned at birth. Whether that you has been defined by the state as documented, whether that you is included in women's only spaces, the way trans women are often not, and whether that you might be like me, who still gets invited to be in women's only spaces, but the mere invitation delegitimizes my existence as a genderqueer person. I am pro-vagina, believe me. I was wondering if you would laugh, so. But vagina does not equal woman, and woman does not equal vagina, and having one does not make you one. The gender binary is also fascism. And I think it's perfect that I went behind you. Because I'm going to be kind of challenging definitions of classical definitions of fascism. There is evidence of two-spirit people in what we call the United States being targeted by white colonizers in processes of genocidal violence. Also, extrajudicial murders of black and brown people by the police is fascism. I don't use this word lightly, and I don't think I'm watering it down by using this word in this moment and in the history of this place. At the National Women's Studies Association conference in November, right after the election, Leanne Bedesomasaki Simpson, who is Michi Anishinaabe scholar, writer, and artist, said that indigenous people have been surviving white supremacy, settler colonialism, and heteropatriarchy for over 500 years, and will continue to do so, and that this is nothing brand new, and that also many have not survived. The occupied skull of the land we are on now, and the people living here have seen over 500 years of fascism. On the book list for surviving fascism that I've seen so far, I do not see women of color and or trans and non-binary authors. I do not see indigenous women and two-spirit people. I do not see titles that look like they are addressing homophobia, transphobia, and ableism. If you have a resource that couches fascism and surviving the new face of fascism, let me know. We are also creating one that's circling around the room, so please add your recommended books to that list. Have you been getting it? Yeah, okay. I'd like to share a quote from Mia Mingus because she provides another way to think through how fascism works. Ableism is included in our analysis of oppression and in our conversations about violence, responses to violence, and ending violence. Ableism cuts across all of our movements because ableism dictates how bodies should function against a mythical norm. An able-bodied standard of white supremacy, heterosexism, sexism, economic exploitation, moral, religious beliefs, age, and ability. Ableism set the stage for queer and trans people to be institutionalized as mentally disabled, for communities of color to be understood as less capable, smart and intelligent, therefore naturally fit for slave labor, for women's bodies to be used to produce children, when, where, and how men needed them, for people with disabilities to be seen as disposable in a capitalist and exploitative culture because we are not seen as productive, for immigrants to be thought of as a disease that we must cure because it is weakening our country, for violence, cycles of poverty, lack of resources, and war to be used as systematic tools to construct disability communities and entire countries. And so with that quote, I want us to think about connections between Nazi Germany and the United States. I want to connect fascism to rape culture, which, as Andrea Smith and others have pointed out, has been and continues to be a way of enacting power and violence, a way of continuing settler colonialism, white supremacy, and heteropatriarchy. Fascism is also not having access to abortion, but as Loretta Ross, founder of Sister Song, points out, reproductive oppression, including forced sterilization and not being able to raise your kids in safety due to racism and immigration policies. This should be part of the conversation about fascism. Rape is fascism, incest is fascism, fascism is the Dakota Access Pipeline. It's saying all lives matter to thus deny the necessity to declare that Black lives matter. Fascism is denying people's and communities' realities, which we see DT, his supporters, and mainstream news doing, which has been happening for hundreds of years. It's part of the gaslighting that is deeply intertwined with perpetrator mindfucking. I'm going to say that again. It's part of the gaslighting that is deeply intertwined with perpetrator mindfucking. It's deeply triggering and makes surviving the mental illnesses difficult. including but not limited to anxiety and depression and PTSD that is unrecognized as such by many sexual assault survivors and people who live with the daily traumas of racism, colonialism, sexism, capitalism, ableism, homophobia, transphobia, and being told you are overreacting to the realities of your lived experience. It's easy to think about the way fascism exists outside of ourselves, but I want to ask, what are the ways has it entered our and your own minds? What do you do about the ways we reenact fascism, and how do you and we unlearn this? Again, not a monolithic you here. I want to emphasize the need for us as communities to take care of each other. Trauma response right now is really high, and especially in people whose lives or loved ones are on the line and whose safety is being deteriorated, and it's only been less than 20 days. May we continue to find ways to nourish radical self and community care, like Leah Lakshmi Piatsina Samasarin has written about. There are a lot of strong community-based organizations right now acting in resistance in Flagstaff, and if you're not already hooked in, I encourage you to do so. And maybe people could just do a quick shout out on what some of those groups are. I see you here. So. I only have one more sentence after that, so please say, I have 2 more minutes. So, do you want to say the names of groups in Flagstaff?
Counteract.
Together we will, Northern area.
Repeal Coalition.
Northern Arizona Interfaith Council.
Northern Arizona Dream Fund.
WH Coalition.
I know there's a
Together we will, Northern Arizona.
Oh, there's
1 Billion Rising.
No more deaths.
Friends, Flagstaff speaking.
Flagstaff Community Coalition.
I know we're missing. What else are we missing?
Standing up for racial justice.
What else?
Defenders of the Access
The Queer Activist Collective, Indigenous Youth for Cultural Survival, the Indigenous Community Forum.
So with that, I will just notice what's in the room right now with us, and I look forward to our conversation tonight, to hearing your ideas about resisting and defying all forms of fascism. Thank you.
This will work well. I think I'm right in between the last two in my way to find it. I'm Sean Parsons. I'm in the Politics and International Affairs Department. So currently there are 2 dominant ways of discussing and explaining fascism that I feel undermine our ability to understand the usage of the term. The first is the way in which fascism become a pejorative used to attack any perspective that you might disagree with. This can be seen with the use of the term to attack conservatives like Bush and Romney, who are conservative and not, in my mind, not fascists, and also by the use of the fascism to mean any coercive use of force. In this latter definition, the anti-fascist protesters attacking Milo and Berkeley are the real fascists. But this usage of the term is nonsensical. If use of coercive force is what defines fascism as an ideology, then all the ideologies are fascists, and the term therefore has no meaning. The other way of talking about fascism that I think is problematic is to only focus on the historic. This perspective sees fascism as a set of platforms of belief exposed by Mussolini and Hitler, and does not believe that fascism grows or develops over time. We do not expect any other ideology to follow this perspective and not to grow. And I think viewing it not as a living ideology is short-sighted and wrong. So what I want to do in my short talk is I want to describe what I think are the core of fascist ideologies and try to understand what an American contextualized fascism theoretically means. So there have been many attempts to define fascism, and all the ones I've seen have had kernels of truth. So Trotsky referred to fascism as a cross-class alliance between the petty bourgeoisie and the ruling elite. Mussolini defined it as a fusion of corporations with the state. And, what's his name? And others have described it as, Roger Griffin has defined it as a form of ultranationalism. All these have some kernels of truth to them. Fascism has every one of these components to it. But I feel that all these definitions focus too much on the European experience on the ground and don't actually engage with the ideological logic that makes them. So I want to define fascism very simply as revolutionary traditionalism. Fascism is revolutionary, unlike traditional conservatism, and such borrows theories and tactics from the revolutionary left. And it is also radically traditional, focusing on the creation of mythic nationalism. This means that fascism in each country and each locale will look and operate differently depending on the contexts. So fascism in Italy in 1930 will look different than fascism in the US then or now. That said, I think there are some overlapping themes that seem to exist within all fascist politics. First, all fascists reject equality and promote rigid hierarchies. These hierarchies are usually structured through an understanding of race and gender, but can also function in other ways. This understanding of natural inequality means that fascists oppose government attempts to promote equality and to develop equality. As such, fascism opposes Marxism, as well in a different way liberal multiculturalism, as both are seen in their minds as creating a form of forced equality. Second, fascism promotes a form of hypermasculinity that sees expression of male strength, be it on the battlefield or in war or in the boardroom of corporations, as essential to defining the nation. In this regard, fascism is an ideology that actively works to strengthen and protect patriarchy, and to fight against feminist critiques of it. The construction of traditional gender roles, the general opposition to homosexuality, or at least the idea of a queer culture, and general hostility towards the feminization of culture are all central aspects of all fascist politics. 3, fascism is unique and differs from right-wing populism because it is both mass-based as well as anti or critical of democracy. We'll see in the American context this changes at all. 4, fascism is critical of capitalism, and especially a form of global capitalism, and instead promotes a form of economic nationalism that seeks to protect and defend national economic inequalities. And 5th and last for the main themes, fascism requires an enemy-friend dynamic. There needs to be both a domestic and a foreign enemy that is an existential threat to the nation. The internal enemy must be used to be described as the core group responsible for the fall from grace from the idealized conception of the nation. And the outside group has to be something to force a cohesive sense of national self. Great. Other than these unique characteristics, I would argue that fascism needs to be understood within the cultural and historical context that it is being described in. So in this case, the US right now has a different, fascism would look differently here than it did in Germany and Italy during the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, and different than it would look like in, for instance, the Philippines right now. When it comes to fascism in the US, I argue that there's 3 different ways that they tend to look at mythologizing US history. And they all look at different time periods, but they all end up coming up with a very similar understanding of politics. 1, fascists can look to the pre-Civil War America as an idealized nation state. In which racial order was protected, traditional conservative values dominated, and America thrived as an economic powerhouse. 2, they can look to the Western frontier and the settler colonial myth of American greatness during this period of colonial expansion, and view that as part of what defines an American identity. And 3rd, they can look to the 1950s where Jim Crow, an American racial apartheid system functioned, where gender norms were strongly enforced, and where economic wealth and prosperity reigned for the white working class American. These are, I think, the 3 historical periods that fascism in the US could look to create this national conception of a mythic self. What you see with all 3 is that traditionalism is structured around racial, gender, and Christian order. All 3 periods mythologize what's called the US Herrenvolk Republic, a republic in which there is democracy for the dominant ethnic and racial majority, and exclusion for the other ethnic and racial groups. Connected to this, fascism in the US will have a more complicated relationship with democracy than either the Italian or the German form. Since white democracy is central to the national myth of American greatness, we should expect American fascists to promote and push for the return of a Herrenvolk or apartheid-style voting system, where white voting is empowered and non-white voting is undermined. Since the US myth of greatness is also tied to capitalism, we will see fascism that is not as radically anti-capitalist in rhetoric as we've seen in other places. Instead, we will see fascists fetishize certain CEOs and great men who succeed while demonizing others for selling out the American working class. My guess is the later hostility will manifest itself in the form of anti-Semitism that attacks Jews who will be perceived as the controllers of outside industry in order to focus anger away from the economic ruling elites. In addition to these broad American aspects, there are certain components of contemporary life that I think will also be impacting it. Oh, shoot. Okay, so I'll go quickly because I mentioned it. First, neoliberalism. So neoliberalism is associated with politics and policies of Reagan and Thatcher. It looked to reinvigorate global capitalism, undermine the welfare state, and marketize most aspects of our personal and political life. The impact of neoliberalism, both in the US and globally, has been the dislocation of working class, the breakdown of union and labor protections, as well as other things. It is also an ideological project that promotes radical individualism, and due to that, we have seen the rise of identity politics as a response to and embedded within the project neoliberalism. What I would expect fascism in the US to do would be an engagement with neoliberalism. It would be a radical critique of neoliberalism. It will use the project and politics of identity politics to form a white identitarian project. And it will go after the cultural permissiveness that has happened with the expansion of commodification of ways of life to reinforce that. Secondly, and tied to neoliberalism is economic globalization. Neoliberalism focuses on breaking down national borders for corporations to allow the free flow of money to travel around the world. This project has furthered the loss of manufacturing jobs and weakened even further union and labor protections. There is also an accepted belief that economic globalization also led to the opening of borders for people to travel. That is not the case. In fact, with the passage of free trade, we have seen a massive militarization of the border and stricter enforcement of immigration laws than we had in the past. That said, there's a perception that the flow of migrants is equal to or with the flow of capital. And with that, I think you could see fascism engaging with this globalization by blaming foreign capital like China and Jewish globalists, while also blaming immigrant groups for the taking of American jobs. Lastly, I'd argue the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan have provided a symbol of Americans' failed foreign policies overseas. As symbols of failure, they represent to this group the feminization of American culture and the loss of American military power globally. They also, ironically, have played a part in providing the longest expanding of militaristic and ultra-masculine values within the US culture. So you have this kind of dual thing where they represent weakness, but have also hyper-masculinized our society. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan are part of a larger project also of constructing Islam as the existential threat to the Western US culture. I would expect contemporary American fascists to highlight both the masculine aspects, or the feminization of the failure in Iraq and Afghanistan, as well as to continue the expansion of Islamophobia. So that, what I want you really get out of my talk is the idea that fascism is, in my mind, a very strict ideology. It has components to it that make it unique from other perspectives, but it is not contingent on what happened in Germany. Fascism is a broad idea, and it grows and develops. It is also, as Alexander Ross Reed talks about, it has a power to creep. So even if fascism does not exist now, it expands and grows, and it takes over different aspects of political and social life. It's something that, even if we don't see it necessarily fully now, we have to be aware that it has the power to grow and expand. So I'll just stop there.
pictures and numbers and while he's logging in, my name is Lori Cloney-Scottinger. I'm the chair of Politics and International Affairs, among other activities. You're going to get to see some pictures. It's thinking. But it's still opening. I think so. Technologically savvy. Alright, so I have been asked to provide a comparative element, and so I'm going to talk about fascism in Europe. I cannot cover every country in Europe, so we're just going to focus on a few, and then I can take questions from there. But when we think about fascism in Europe, like Sean was just talking about, usually what comes to mind is a form of radical authoritarian nationalism that came to prominence in the earliest 20th century. All right, it started in Italy, and the elephant in the room, no pun intended, is that it flipped over to Nazi Germany. Right, so that's usually what we think of when we think of fascism in Europe. What we see in Europe today may not meet strict definitions of fascism, but we're definitely seeing a resurgence of nationalism. We're definitely seeing a resurgence of authoritarianism, and we're seeing some fascist leanings in there. So when we talk about what happened in Europe before World War II, or in that interwar period, then there was some sort of trauma. So usually fascism comes about when we talk about some sort of national trauma. So then the national trauma was the global economic crisis of 1929 and reparations from the Treaty of Versailles. Right? Now, what we're seeing is globalization that is increasing the gap between winners and losers in an economic system, which is increasing uncertainty. Right? We have the financial crisis of 2008, which is 8 years ago. Maybe for a lot of you, you don't remember, but it's still pretty central in a lot of adults' minds. Right? And we have increased migratory pressure, which for some people is changing the face of Europe. So the first country we'll focus on is France. And the countries I picked are countries that have upcoming elections, right? So maybe what can we learn about their upcoming elections? And we're going to talk about how maybe their institutions mitigate some of these right leanings. Right? They will have their first round election on the 23rd of April, and a second round election on the 7th of May. The person at the front of the story in France is Marine Le Pen. I didn't mean a pun there, I'm just tired. She's also of the National Front, and that's her political party. So when we're looking at some of her policy positions, these are things that she said. We can harken back to what we've heard sort of theoretically people say before, terms and ideas related to fascism. She's talked about there being two totalitarians that are trying to subjugate France. The two totalitarians that she's talking about is Islam and globalization. France has a really strong economy. It's the sixth strongest economy in the world. But she depicts France in her speeches as being a besieged wreck of a country. Right? That's a direct translation. She has been quoted as saying, "I'm against the right of money and the left of money. I'm a candidate of the people." Right? She has promised that there'll be a referendum on the EU within 6 months. It has promised a Frexit. She's also called for very strong curtails on immigration. France has a very long history of immigration from Northern Africa. She's called on curtails on that. And she has called Vladimir Putin the defender of Christian Europe. Right? So that's Marine Le Pen. Well, how's Marine Le Pen doing in the polls? Right now, when we have her in a national poll against all the candidates, and there's a lot of people up there, right? We're going to talk about how that mitigates these influences in just a second. She's polling at 26%. Keep that number in mind, close to 30%, right? Close to 30%. Well, what happens in France is if you do not get 50% of the vote in the first round, you go to a second round election system. All right, and that will be between the top two vote getters. Well, the two people she could be up against in the second round are Francois Fillon, and he is from, they're called the Republicans now, they used to be the UMP. They're the major party of the right in France. And Emmanuel Macron, who's from the EM, which is a new political party. It means like going forward, moving. And this is a new political party of the left. You will notice that the traditional left, the Socialist Party, which is not, it can be confused with the Communist Party, it's democratic socialism, that party is not up here. All right, we're going to talk about that in just a second. So when Le Pen is facing either the traditional party of the right or this new party of the left, she doesn't win. All right, so in those instances, she's polling 43, 35% to 57, 65%. All right, why do we see this happening? Well, it's because of the way their institutions are structured. So here, back here, that vote on the left and the right is split between many different political parties. It's a multi-party system. All right, when they go to a runoff, what happens is they coalesce along each of their sides. All right, the far right does not win in that instance. All right, Austria is our next example because Austria just had an election on December 4th. This was their presidential election. And in Austria, the French one is the presidential election, but the French president has power. In Austria, the president doesn't really have power, but this election was important because of what happened in it. All right, and what happened in it was Norbert Hofer. And it's that guy on the, what's that, left? Okay, give me left. All right, Hofer is a member of the Freedom Party. He ran on a platform of putting Austria first. It rings a bell. And he talked about the dissolution of trade agreements. He talked about restoring Austria to greatness. He ran on an anti-immigrant platform of closing Austria's borders. Right? And in the first round, Austria also has a two-round system. In the first round of voting, he got the most votes, or at about 35%. Again, here around about a third of the population. Right? In second round voting, he ran against the person who came in second, or Alexander Van der Bellen, who is of the Green Party. Right? When Hofer was against Alexander Van der Bellen, he lost. But look at those differences aren't as strong. Right? Hofer got 48.2% of the vote, and Alexander Van der Bellen for 53.8% of the vote.
Adds up to 102.
Oh yeah, oh sorry, I presented that wrong. Sorry. Yeah. I'm tired, I typed it wrong. All right, the next country on our list is the Netherlands. The Netherlands is important because they have an election coming up in about a month, March 15th. The person at the center of the story in the Netherlands is Geert Wilders. Geert Wilders is the leader of the far-right Party for Freedom, of the PVV. This party runs almost exclusively on an anti-Islamic platform, talking about not having the Islamization of the Netherlands. He is currently actually on trial for inciting hatred against Dutch Moroccans, and he's been previously tried for inciting racial hatred. Right? He has also run on a platform of closing borders. He has promised that Netherlands will leave the euro, and he's promised to close all mosques in the country. Well, how's he doing? He's the gray line there. Right, so currently, and this is from 2013 through 2017, again, we see a lot of political parties, right? So we have a multi-party system, lots of parties. He's polling at about 30%, right? About a third, once again, this should be a theme, a third of the population, right? And he is now polling at the top, right? He has the most support. Well, will he lead the Netherlands? No. Why won't he lead the Netherlands? Well, because they have a parliamentary system. You need to have more than 50% of the support in the parliament in order to govern. And all the other parties have said they will not govern with him. They won't form a coalition with him. So what you will likely see happen is with this polling continues. It's been a month. This happens the same way. The Netherlands, why they're not able to form a government for a while, or they will have a coalition of many different political parties operating together in coalition, which isn't always stable. And our final country is Germany. Germany has federal elections coming up on September 24th. And the person at the center of the German story is Frauke Petry. Frauke Petry is the leader of the Alternative for Germany. Right, this is the furthest right legal political party in Germany. There are further right illegal political parties, but this is the furthest right legal political party. But the further right illegal political parties, the Nazi parties, don't usually poll over 1 or 2%. Right, she has compared multiculturalism to a compost heap. She has said that border patrol should use firearms when necessary when dealing with refugees trying to enter. She has a manifesto that says Islam is not part of Germany. This is particularly, like in France, particularly bothersome in Germany because they have a long history of Turks in the country. She's called on a ban on minarets and burqas. And her party has done better than expected in state elections. They have peeled votes away from the CDU, which is the traditional party of the right, of Angela Merkel's party, but still not over about 15% support. All right, so where is she polling right now? She's the blue line. She's polling at about 12%. I'm going to skip through there and I'm going to talk for 1 second. 1 second. All right, so take-home points. Support across Europe of far-right parties is hovering about 30%, about a third of the population. Right, this support has been accompanied by a crisis among the traditional left. Right, the traditional left has split into the workers' left in most instances and a left libertarian left, and they haven't been able to kind of garner support one way or another, large support. Right, we're likely in the future to see grand coalitions form, which means we're going to see parties of the left and right entry together in coalition. And what we are seeing is known as an authoritarian post-materialism in Europe. And I can talk about that more later if you have questions. But basically where cultural issues are important, but people want authoritarian leaders. Right, so cultural authoritarianism. And this, like Ray was talking about from the 80s, this was predicted by somebody named Flanagan in the 1980s, that we would see this start to develop in Europe.
Here okay in the back? Everything all right? All right, my name is Luis, and I'm going to close this up. Hopefully, I was going to say try to keep it shorter than 10, but I'm a faculty member, which means probably not. I'm going to do my best. So what I'm going to do today is actually talk to you about the alt-right. I was fortunate enough very recently to listen to a lecture by Matthew Lyons, who has a blog called The Three-Corridor Fight, and this is an individual that has been following right-wing movements for a couple of decades. And he was able to pretty quickly outline what the alt-right was. And I was so impressed with it that I thought I'd share some of the things that I learned. I came back, read some information that he provided, and I want to share it with you in terms of that. So my purpose here today is to talk to you about the alt-right here in the United States and its development. And I want to hit 3 different points. One of them is I just want to very quickly talk about its composition. Who are they? 2, I want to talk about the ideological components of the alt-right. And 3, talk a little bit about the strategies and maybe hopefully actually bring it home to you with a very close example to you. So hold on with that. So starting with the composition. I think that the alt-right, the term alt-right develops in 2008 when Richard Spencer, and you might know Richard Spencer as that individual that actually, there was a video of him getting nailed in the head with an elbow. that particular Richard Spencer came up with the term in 2008, and here is what he says. These are his words. Alt-right He describes the alt-right adherents as young people, often recent college graduates, who recognize the uselessness of mainstream conservatism and what he describes as a hyper-racialized world, right? So he describes that the world is hyper-racialized and that these comes from young college graduates that are actually that are gathering together, right? In 2000 and 2006, the alt-right movement centers on opposing immigration, so they take that as an issue, and very strongly began to oppose Syrian refugees in the US. So that's kind of a component. Although such stances align with older forms of white racism, meaning that some stances within the alt-right have very similar stances that go back to just traditional, I actually don't like people of color issues. And Spencer insists that the alt-right is a libertarian form of left-right dialectic that is coming out of this left-right push that has happened over the last few years, and is a result of that particular dynamic. The alt-right is not a coherent group. So that doesn't mean that the alt-right is here as one group and they all adhere to the same philosophy, they all adhere to it's actually a broad range of individuals that ranges directly from Nazis. So in that sense, yeah, fascist, because they actually adhere to the Nazi party, which is a fascist party. So it goes from there to just white supremacists, to what Matthew Lyons calls the alt-light. And the alt-light are individuals that are not quite there, but are kind of tending in that particular direction and kind of straddling that particular position. I'll talk about those in a second. As such, the